In October 1949, the New York Times announced a sensational discovery. An ancient manuscript of Mishneh Torah was discovered, and it contained a long-lost provocative passage about the Christian founder. The headline sparked excitement, but the story was riddled with errors. In this class, we trace the real history of that passage and examine when, how, and why it was cut by the censor. In the New York Times on October 24, 1949, alongside an ad for Camel cigarettes, and where the paper of record tells us that not one single case of throat irritation came from smoking Camels. This was after a 30-day test by throat specialists. So to the left of that, we have an article with the following headline: View of Maimonides on Christ found in long-lost manuscript. Now, before I continue talking about this article in the New York Times, I want to mention a Dvar Halacha. It was actually in the Rambam and Gimel Prakim, it was in yesterday's shir, on the idea that one is not allowed to mention a name of Avodah Zarah. And there is a comment over there from the Agoyes Maimonides, and where he says that this only applies to names of Avodah Zarah that were given for Avodah Zarah purposes, and those names convey the idea of Adnos. So somehow in the name, there's Avodah Zarah smelling in the very name. However, if a Jewish mother gives a child a regular given name that average people have, and then later that person becomes associated with Avodah Zarah, so there is no halachic problem with mentioning this name, which is why in the Talmud it says Yeshu on numerous occasions. This is what the Agoyes Maimonides says on the Rambam of yesterday, quoting a teaching from earlier Rishonim. That said, there is a Chavas Yar that I once saw writing in the 1600s, and where he says that Minig Yisrael, although there's no Isser, the Minig Yisrael has been to avoid mentioning his name. I don't know if that Minig is only if you say it the way the non-Jewish world says it, or even if you say it the way the Gemara says it. So, but he does say that there is such a minig. So, generally speaking, I try to observe that minig, but in materials that I'm going to be reading, if it has the name, I am going to just read it the way it is. As you're going to see, the continuation of this shir, I think, will justify that approach. Okay, so back to the headline: View of Maimonides on Christ found in long-lost manuscript. This is very exciting. It's 1949, and the view of the Rambam about Yeshu HaNotzri is finally found in a long-lost manuscript. Then there's a subtitle: Yale Press publishes scholar's statement. What was the scholar's statement, meaning the Rambam statement? Jesus was not the Messiah. His proof being, so what's the evidence? His proof being that Israel was destroyed. So the fact that Am Yisrael was destroyed is the raya that he was not the Messiah. Okay, we're very intrigued by this. We want to read what is this discovery, what is this all about. So let's go ahead and read the article. So we read the article, and it says as follows. Comes out of New Haven, Connecticut, and here this report was written up on October 23rd. A long-lost statement on Jesus Christ by Maimonides, leading Hebrew sage of the Middle Ages, has been found recently and appears in a volume just published by the Yale University Press. The discovery is made by the Reverend Dr. Abraham H. Hirschman, Hebrew scholar of Detroit. This Abraham Hirschman was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary. That's the school associated with the conservative movement. In 1906 is when he received his ordination. And at this point, in 1949, he is a rabbi of a congregation in Detroit. The article continues and says, where did he find this? In an examination of early manuscripts and rare copies of the Code of Maimonides. Dr. Hirschman was engaged in making the first translation from the Hebrew of Book 14 of the Code, known as the Book of Judges, or Sefer Shoftim, for the Yale Judaica series that you have here on the right. This is the copy in the Rebbe's library, the Code of Maimonides, book 14, the book of Judges. Abraham Hirschman is the translator. It's coming out in 1949. Eventually Yale will publish many of these over the years with an English translation. If I recall correctly, this was the second one they released. And it wasn't an accident that it was the book of Judges. There were people who were saying at the time, given the establishment of the state of Israel, so there needs to be a re-examination of Hilchos Shoftim, and we need to learn this, and Hilchos Sanhedrin, because this stuff is applicable today to the Jewish legal life in the new state of Israel. This may also be the impetus behind the production of the Rambam La'am that happened at the same time. But anyway, so back to the article. It says, so they're reporting about the book, but they don't really care about the book. The article is about this long lost statement. So the article continues and says, in the long missing statement, Maimonides held that Jesus was not the Messiah because he did not meet with full success and was slain. Again, that's a quote. Why was he not the Messiah? Because he did not meet with full success and was slain. This is a very interesting lashon. It sounds like the Rambam is saying, according to this report, that he had a little success, he just didn't meet full success and was slain. Okay, and by the way, who slew him? Also not there in the quote. Okay, he continues quoting, all the prophets, this is, so to speak, Rambam speaking, all the prophets affirmed that the Messiah would redeem Israel, save them, gather there dispersed, and confirm the commandments. But he, referring to the Christian founder, caused Israel to be destroyed by the sword, their remnants to be dispersed and humiliated, Maimonides wrote. The Hebrew sage said that if Christ and Muhammad could not be accepted by the Jews as Messiah, both must be commended for awakening knowledge of monotheism amongst the people of the world, who otherwise might remain pagan. Very interesting lashon. If there can't be Messiah, these people, but they deserve to be commended. Wow, Rambam says that Yeshua HaNotzri needs to be commended, that Muhammad needs to be commended. Quote, all these matters relating to Jesus of Nazareth and to Muhammad only serve to clear the way for King Messiah, to prepare the whole world to worship God with one accord, end quote, Maimonides wrote. Maimonides' discussion of Christ was expunged by censors in the Middle Ages and had been missing in every available edition of the code. But Dr. Hirschman found one old manuscript that had escaped suppression. So wow, this is amazing. Hirschman really did amazing work by finding the one and only Ksav Yad in the whole world, this article seems to be telling us, that had this statement. The statement occurred in a treatise on the book of Judges entitled Laws Concerning Kings and Wars. That's Hilchos Milchames. Melachim ul Milchameseim. It formed the body of Maimonides' legal theological discussion holding that Jesus was not the biblical Messiah. This is the article. It's a little, I pointed out a number of times, at a number of occasions, I pointed out some things that were interesting, just to make one or two other points. Why is he not Mashiach according to this article? He's not Mashiach simply because he caused problems to Israel. So in other words, only because he hurt Yidden. Doesn't sound like, if you read this article, doesn't sound like there's any philosophical concerns or any Shitta problems. Another interesting thing is it says that they paved the way for monotheism. That's very interesting because are we going to say monotheism about Christianity? This is a very important question. This article seems to say unequivocally that the Rambam's position was yes. And so this is very, very interesting. And we're going to gain more clarity about all of this as we move along here this evening. Okay, so what is this passage? Where is this passage? He's saying that he found it in a manuscript. Baruch Hashem, there are plenty of manuscripts of the Rambam that have this passage. We're going to go to a Ksav Yad that was written and copied in the year 1433. It's a Yemenite manuscript. Those are usually the best bets for this because even if you had a Ksav Yad from earlier, but if it was in Europe, there's a good chance that it was going to be censored later on, even if it was written whenever it was written. But later on, as we're seeing in the 16th century, a strong possibility it would have been censored, as I'm going to show you. But in Yemen, no one was bothered by this. And so there you have, usually this passage appears there unhindered. So that's what this Ksav Yad is from the year 1433. Let's read together where the red lines are. Af Yeshu. So the Rambam here is discussing that someone could be Cheskas Mashiach, but then they're not Mashiach Vadai. So if they go ahead and they do the steps necessary to become Mashiach Vadai, that include building the base of Mikdash, etc., then we know they're Mashiach Vadai. But what if they didn't do that, or they were killed? So then we know that this is not the person who Torah commanded us about, and whatever, it's just a test and fine. But the Rambam here is talking about a Yid, and perhaps a good Yid, and not someone who did anything wrong. He was Cheskas Mashiach, it just didn't turn out, Mashiach didn't become Mashiach Vadai. And then it's at that point where the passage continues, and he says, Af Yeshu Anoitzri, Shadim Moshe Mashiach. When it comes to Yeshu, he imagined that he was Mashiach, V'ner Rak Bezdin, and he was killed, he was executed by the Jewish court, Kfar Nesnabe by Daniel. So the emes the Rambam says that there's a prophecy in Daniel about this person, Shenemar, because it says in Daniel, Ubnei Pritze Amecha, it says that there's going to be the people who are breaking away from the renegades from your people, from the Jewish people, V'nasu Lahamid Chazoin, they're going to rise up to establish a certain type of vision, v'nichshalu. However, they are going to stumble. That's the pasuk. Says the Rambam. This referring to Yeshu and his followers, because v'chiyesh michshal gadol mizeh. Was there a bigger stumbling block than this? Shekol anavim dibru shamashiach goyel Yisrael. All of the prophets spoke about how Mashiach is going to redeem the Jewish people. U'moishiam, and save them. U'makabetz nitcheyam, and gather the Yidden that are spread all over the world. U'machzik mitzvasan, and he will strengthen their mitzvahs. V'zeh, however, this individual, Garam la'abed Yisrael, he caused the Yidden to be destroyed, b'charev, by sword, u'lefazer she'erisam, and for them to be dispersed, ulashpilam, and denigrated, ulahachlif haTorah, and he changed the Torah, ulahatais l'roiv ha'olam, and he caused a mistake for so many citizens of the world, la'avaid aleikam beladei Hashem, to worship a God other than the true God. Okay, so that's a very serious statement that the Rambam makes about Yeshua Noitzri, and if you're able to tell, a lot of this was not in that article. A lot of this was not said in that article, meaning the article did quote a piece from this about the destruction and the damage that came to Am Yisrael, but the idea of lahachlif haTorah and the idea of lahatis roiv ha'olam lavayd aleikam beladei Hashem, that was completely absent from the New York Times piece. The piece continues, Aval machshvais beira olam, when it comes to the thoughts of the Creator of the world, ein koyach ba'adam la'asigan, we don't have the ability to grasp them. Kiloi drachenu dracha v'loi machshavosenu machshavos, of his ways are in our ways, and our ways are in his ways, and our thoughts are in his thoughts. All of this that regards Yeshu. And this Ishmaelite who arose after him, they're only to create a path towards Mashiach, and to correct and to fix the entire world, to ultimately serve God together. Shenemar, and he brings the pasuk that one day when the Mashiach comes, there's going to be likroi kulam b'shem Hashem. Everyone's going to call out by Hashem's name. Now it's important. Rambam didn't say over here that it's already monotheism. Rambam said it's a step that will in the future lead to monotheism, which then leads to the question of Ketzad. How is that? So the Rambam here makes the argument. First of all, the whole world's talking about Mashiach. Number one. Number two, u'medivrei HaTorah, they're talking about Torah. Number three, u'medivrei HaMitzvahs, and they're talking about mitzvahs. U'pashtu dvarim elu be'im rechoikim, u'va'amim rabim arlei leiv. And these words have spread into the furthest isles, and to nations that are very arlei leiv, and I'm not sure how to even translate that. And there's discussions about it. And they discuss the mitzvahs and the Torah. Some people say mitzvahs elu. What's that word over there? Emes hayu, were once true. Vikfar batlu bizman hazeh, but they're no longer relevant. And they're not forever. The Rambam here is contending with a Christian piece of their theology that says the mitzvahs were just once upon a time. It's sometimes said to prove that it's not really doable. And that therefore you need to have a guide and you need to believe in that person because there's no other way to salvation. So therefore there was once a time you needed it, you don't need it anymore. And likewise Muslims say a similar idea, that maybe there was once a time but no longer. And then he says there are some others that say that there's allegory involved, and they're not literal. And Mashiach has already come, meaning the Christian founder has come and already revealed the deeper meaning. Okay. This is another school within Christianity that views many of the mitzvahs as allegories. Rather than saying they're batal, say no, it's always, but it's an allegory for some of the truth, but not that kipshuta that you need to do the mitzvah. Okay, so the bottom line the Rambam saying is, the world, are they monotheists yet? The Rambam did not say that. And the Rambam is not going to be able to say that because the Rambam did not believe that Christianity is monotheistic. But what he could say is, they're talking about Mashiach, they're talking about Torah, they're talking about mitzvahs. It sets the stage, at least the conversation. Before then, we didn't reach these people. They weren't even able to have this conversation. And so he concludes the piece by saying, when the true Mashiach rises, and he's going to be successful, so then immediately and kulam chayzrin, they're all going to recant the yoidim, and they will know sheshekar nachalu avayseyam v'sheneviyem v'avayseyam hitum. They will then know that their prophets and their ancestors had misled them. This is the passage that is in the Kisvei Yad of the Rambam. It's the end of chapter 11 of Hilchas Melachim Ul Milchamei Sehem, and that Abraham Hirschman says, or the New York Times article says, that he discovered the single manuscript that had this, and he's publishing it. And as we could already tell, he published it. What he wrote, not mamish the same, or not what he wrote. I don't know who wrote the article in the New York Times. Whoever wrote the article in the New York Times doesn't mamish convey all of the points that the Rambam is saying. The average reader would walk away with just a complete positive statement about Yeshu. Great, monotheistic, and everything. However, then he didn't help the Jews; he hurt the Jews, and so therefore that's why he can't be Mashiach. But that's pretty much it. And everything else sounds like it's checks all around.
You have the translation?
What was that?
The actual translation from the Yale University Press.
We'll get there. Bez Hashem. We did all the hard work for you. Okay. So I said Yemenite manuscripts have this. If you go to manuscripts from the Middle Ages that were in Europe, they once had them. But as you can see in this from the 1200s in Amsterdam, this is a Ksav Yad of Mishneh Torah Rambam, and you could see it's the end of chapter 11 of Hilchas Melachim. The passage was there. It's the exact same passage. Maybe there are minor variations, but it's essentially the same thing. And someone came along and blotted out some key lines that were there. We actually know who this person is, and that's because at the end of the volume, there is a colophon that tells us when the original manuscript was written, and there is also the censor's mark. You make it a little bigger, you see, Barzilai Bar Rabbi Yaakov Halevi is the one who wrote this manuscript, and he tells us when. When was it first? He tells us where. B'medinas Narbona, v'seyamtim, he concluded it when? Chodesh Shvat, Shnas Chameshas Halafim, that's the year 1240, v'shtayim v'arboim, that's 1282. 1282 Librias Oilam is when he wrote, that's within the century of Rambam's life, that this Ksav Yad was written all the way in Western Europe, in Narbonne, and that's the Ksav Yad. And originally it had this passage there, and then you can see the date 1555 on the bottom, on the left, and the name of Dominos Jacobus Geraldini is the one who censored this, and that is again in the 16th century. The censorship, as we're going to see, is a maisa from the 16th century. So the bottom line is, you have this in the manuscripts, but he's telling us by the time you come to 1949, you don't have this really anywhere, and you needed Hirschman to discover it. And that's true. The typical Rambam in 1949 would have looked like this. This is the classic Vilna edition, which was replicated many, many times thereafter. And Perek Yud Aleph is actually very short. It says, there's Chaskas Mashiach, then it says, and Im Asava Itzliach, then Harei Mashiach Bevadai, and then there's two lines about Mashiach being Mesaken as Olam Kulo, Elaved as Hashem, those two lines are from within that larger passage about Yeshu HaNotzri, but completely removed from its original context, and it's just a nice way of finishing Perek Yud Aleph. the average Rambam that a Jew encountered in the 1600s and in the 1700s and in the 1800s and in the 1900s would have looked roughly like this, which is why, big news, 1949, major discovery, Abraham Hirschman, that it reaches the New York Times. Now, from the New York Times, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency on the next day decides this is important enough news to send out to all its affiliates around the world. And so we start seeing a lot of interest. And so the top left is November 1949, Jewish newspaper in Detroit. Dr. Hirschman finds work of Maimonides. This is front page news. Okay, Minnesota. Long lost statement on Christ found. This is from Minnesota, November 1949. All the way, Sydney, Australia. Maimonides manuscript found. This is big news. Many of the Jewish newspapers are carrying. This is very, very exciting. This is very, very important. This is very, very interesting. And a weekly that comes out in Detroit, the Jewish News, in early December of 1949, top left, right, like, where New York Times writes all the news that's fit to print, they write, Maimonides' passage on Jesus Christ rediscovered. Okay, and then they have this scholarly treatise, and where it says, Detroit rabbi's work contains his rediscovery of Rambam's comments on Jesus. And then it says, Dr. Hirschman states that he hopes to discuss the Maimonides passages on Jesus in a special article. Christian and Jewish scholars already have indicated a deep interest in the subject he has raised and are encouraging him to write the article as soon as possible. So the world is very, very excited at this fresh news, and everyone is very intrigued. So what we want to know at this point is, so how did this happen? How did it happen that you had it all in the manuscripts? It seems you had this passage. And what's the story of how did it start disappearing in print? So much so by 1949, they're saying no one knows anything about this, and the typical print of Rambam doesn't have it. So this is essentially going to be, for the next few minutes, we're going to tell the story of the printing of the Rambam, because the story of the censorship of this passage goes together with the story of the first 100 years of printing of the Rambam. The very first printing of the Rambam happened in Rome around the year 1470. So this is when printing is brand new. Printing is a Maisa from around 1450. So it's about 20 years later that there's a number of Svarim that are printed in Rome. This is very early on in the game for printing. And this is known as the Rome Mishneh Torah. And what happens over here is that generally speaking, this passage is there. At the end of Perek Achadasar, as you can see on the screen, it's there. I'll make it a little bigger so that you're able to see it. You see on the left it says Af, and then there's a space, Shadima. So basically, it's Af Yeshu Anoitzri Shadima. Just remove the words Yeshu Anoitzri. So those two words are not there, but there's a space there. And that space is intentional. The space is intentional. You get the copy at home. You'll add it in with a pen and paper, or you won't add it in, but you'll know that something was missing over there. And likewise later, where Rambam said, V'chol advarim ha'elu, shel Yeshu hanoitzri v'shel zeh ha'yishmaeli, they took out the words shel Yeshu hanoitzri, and again left a space. But other than that, the passage is presented perfectly with just those two spaces. This, in fact, was a methodological shita that the printers of this Rome Mishneh Torah had. Rambam mentioned in his original work mentions Yeshu 4 times, meaning here it's twice, and then another 3 times. And they took out all of them. Obviously, what's happening is this is printing. They understand this is not like a manuscript. This is more public. We're in Rome. Let's be careful. Let's just take those words out. So here are the other examples. This is actually the Rambam for Aleph Adar. That's Wednesday of this week. It's Perek Asiri of Hilchos Avodah Zarah, where the Rambam says as follows: Moise Yisrael. So I have here on the screen 2 images. The top image is from the Rome Mishneh Torah. The bottom image is the Rabbi Kapach's edition of the Mishneh Torah, which reflects the Yemenite manuscript. So here we're just going to read it off of this instead of reading it off of the Kisvei Yad. So what's the text? The text says like this: the Moisrei Yisrael, the Jews who hand over fellow Jews and give them over to the Gentiles, Vehaminin, and the sectarians, and Apikursin. So that's another form of a sectarian. We're actually going to talk more about that probably next week. Mitzvah la'abdam biyad. There's a mitzvah to actually end our lives. Ulahoidid ad be'er shachas, and to bring them all the way to the end. Mipnei shehein mitzeirim liyisrael umesirin nesam achar Hashem, because they cause so much harm and pain to us, and they remove the Jews from Hashem. Kigoin tzaddik ubaisais v'talmideim. This applies to the tzedukim, the baitusim, and their students. Shem Rishaim Yirkov. May their names be blotted out. Originally it said Ki Yeshu Hanoitzri v'talmidav v'tzaddik ubaisais v'talmideihan. However, the Yeshu Hanoitzri v'talmidav was removed from the Rome Mishneh Torah. Next example comes from Hilchos Tshuva, Perek Gimel, where the Rambam here is discussing of those who don't have a shir in Olam Haba. And one of the categories is people who are Machtiei Harabim. And he gives a whole bunch of examples here of people who are Machtiei Harabim. And he says people who cause other people to serve Avodah Zarah, or Shehita Acherim Veidicham, or they just misled others, Ki Yeshua. That's what it says in the manuscripts, but that last word, Ki Yeshua, is removed from the Rome Mishneh Torah, and all it says is Oishahita Acherim Veidicham, without having an example, which is actually interesting because most of the cases in Halacha Yud over here, or in the 10th entry here, have examples, but this one doesn't have example, and now we know why it doesn't have example, because the example was removed. And finally, the last example is in Perek Revi in Hilchos Tshuva, where the Rambam discusses the things that block a person from doing tshuva. And the fourth item is V'amavazer Raboisa, a person who is disrespectful toward their teacher. Why? Because that's going to mean that their teachers are going to alienate them. And he gives an example, like Yeshua and like Gechazi. Yeshu and Gechazi. Gechazi is the Talmud of Elisha, and Yeshu is Yeshu. And both of these people were alienated from their teachers, and then you don't have anyone who could teach you and could show you the right way, so you're not going to be able to do teshuvah. Well, what happened was, and in the Rome Mishneh Torah, they just suffice, like one example is enough, Ki Gechazi, and they took out Ki Yeshu. So this was the Rome Mishneh Torah, printed around the year 1470. It keeps everything in, but it just takes out the name Yeshu. This was its guiding philosophy. And this Maisa continued in the next few printings that happened, most of which happened in Italy. The next printing of the Rambam was Sansino in Italy in 1490. And here they basically did the same thing that the Rome did, with a few differences. Key difference is they took out the space. So now it's hard to read. It's Af Shadima Sheyia Moshiach, and you have to it's Af ... I took out a name, Shadima Sheyia Moshiach, but they took out the space. So now it's harder to tell that something is supposed to be inserted there, and also the sentence now actually doesn't really make sense. It's not a legible sentence. And then later on, here again, they took out the space, so now maybe the average person doesn't know that something here is missing, but other than that, and also they took out Zeha Yishmaeli, they took out those words as well. But okay, generally speaking, the passage is there in the Sansino edition of the Mishneh Torah, 1490. Then the century turns. Now we're in the beginning of the 16th century. The next printing of the Rambam happens in Constantinople. Constantinople is a very impressive story because the Yidden who were expelled from Spain in 1492, they came to Constantinople, and within a few years they had a full press up and running, and they were publishing many Sfarim, and one of the earlier Sfarim that they published was the Mishneh Torah. And what they did is they basically followed the same model. They have the passage there, and what they did is they actually made it a little clearer by adding the word Oisai Ha'ish. So it says Af Oisai Ha'isha Dimo Sheyiyah Moshiach. So instead of it saying Yeshu Anoitzri, or instead of it saying what the Rome and Sansino had, it says Af Oisai Ha'isha Dimo Sheyiyah Moshiach. So now it actually makes sense. That's a sentence that works. And likewise, they followed what Rome did in the second instance. And this is true for the other instances as well. Okay, so far we have 3 editions of the Mishneh Torah that have been printed. All 3 of them have the passage, though they're careful not to mention the name of Yeshu Hanoitzri. Now we move to the next printing of the Mishneh Torah. The next printing of the Mishneh Torah is Bamberg, 1524. This is the famous Daniel Bamberg, who published the Gemara, the Talmud, in the early 1520s. He also prints a Rambam in 1524. He publishes it with the Migdal Ois around it as a commentary. And here he basically follows the same model. Af Oisai Shadima Sheyeh Moshiach. And he, again, you have the passage over there, minor differences, but you have the passage, just no reference to Yeshua Noitzri. Okay, let's fast forward. Now we go to the year 1550. 1550, we famously had two printings of the Rambam in the same year. We've spoken about this in the past. The Justinian printing of the Rambam and the Bragadin printing of the Rambam. Here, the passage was there, pretty much exactly the way it was by the other Italian printings and the printing in Constantinople. However, just like I showed you before, a manuscript that had the passage, but it was expunged by a censor, so too here in this particular passage, it was expunged by a censor, but in a way that many years later today, that ink has faded away, and we're able to read the passage through and under the censorship. And what was that? Yeah, so here his name. His name is here at the end of the early volume. So this is the end of volume 2. Here's his name.
Does it say Yeshua's name and on the
No, it doesn't say Yeshua's name. It doesn't say. It says Af Oisei Shadima Sheyeh Moshiach. It's the same like all the other Italian. No, so far we haven't seen one printing that put his name, but they all have the passage. In terms of the censor's name is Luigi de Bologna, 1599. He is on. They all sign their names at the end of the book, and then it's a hechsher. Now you know that book is legal in Italy, where this censorship is taking place. So and Bragadin also had the passage there. You can't see it because it's been the copy in the National Library in Eretz Yisrael has been completely removed. So that copy you can't see it, but by the fact that it's removed tells you that it was there. So the bottom line is we have six printings between the years 1470 and 1550. 6 different printings, all of which had. So what changed? What happened that when you come to the famous Vilna edition of the Mishneh Torah and 1949, where like no one even knows about this passage. So the Maisa that changed this was a Maisa from 1553. And in Campo di Fiori, which is in Rome, you have the following plaque over there where it says Shali Srufa Be'esh Lishloim Avelayach, reference to fire. The fact that many Svarim were burned, as it says, destroyed on the 9th of September 1553, which is Rosh Hashanah in the year Shin Yod Dalet. This is during a very interesting period of time in Western Europe where you have the Protestant Reformation, and so the Catholics are very, very nervous about that, and there's something called the Counter-Reformation, and that is, no, we're going to become better Catholics. And part of that means to control what people are reading and what types of ideas are out there. They need to control what the Protestants are saying, and we shouldn't have their books circulating. And once you're on that, then we should have to be looking at the Jews as well. So it's within that broader context that you have a much stricter scrutiny against what's there in Jewish books. And here is a document, I once showed this in the past. This is from the Brzezinski collection. It's a document dated September 9, 1553. Remember, that's the actual day of the flames. The commissar of the College of Cardinals declares in this letter that on that day at Campo di Fiori in Rome, the Talmud was burnt, and similar edict is expected in Venice coming up. This is the original document, and that leads later in the decade to this famous index. This is a very interesting index that is put out by the church in Rome, 1559, as you could see on the left-hand side, and it says in alphabetical order all the books that you're not allowed to read. And one of them is, on the right-hand side, the Talmud Hebraeum, the Talmud and its glosses, annotations, interpretations, and expositions thereof, written in Latin. So this is the banning of the Talmud. What does that apply to? Does it apply to the Rambam? Does it not apply to the Rambam? At the very least, that's going to be ambiguous. And it's within this context that we get the Mishneh Torah that we spoke about last week, the Kesef Mishnah's Mishneh Torah, which is printed in 1574, 1576. That's the first printing after this mess in 1553. And this is where you get to Perek Yud Aleph of Hilchos Malachim or Milchamei Seyam, and you have a very, very short Perek Yud Aleph, as you can see over here. You could be Chaskas Mashiach, you could be Mashiach Vadai, and then it concludes with the Yisaken Es Ha'olam, Likroi Kulam, B'Shem Hashem, La'avdei Shechem Echad, like you had it in the Vilna Mishneh Torah. This is where it happened. It happened over here in this 1574, 1576 Kesef Mishneh Torah, which was during this period of stricter scrutiny against Jewish books. That also explains the censorship we saw before in a manuscript and in an earlier print of the same century. It was within this context. There's two types of censorship. One is a pre-press censorship, like you're seeing here on the screen. Another is you already have the books, okay, but we're going to come in with our magic marker and we are going to deal with it, whether it's a printed book or whether it is a manuscript. And so therefore comes Mr. Hurt. That is the story of how this passage was lost. And what you know already by now is that it's not just one Ksav Yad in the world that had this passage. Many Kisva Yad had this passage. Many prints, no less than 6 prints, had this passage. But at the same time, it is true that starting from 1574 onward, with a few exceptions, which we'll see soon, you don't really have this passage anywhere. So Abraham Hirschman made this major discovery, New York Times, all the newspapers from Sydney, Australia, and all over. Well, one of the other places that this news reaches is Eretz Yisrael. And the newspapers in Eretz Yisrael cover this story as well. And so, a few days after this news hits Eretz Yisrael, you get a response. And the response is, hello, Das HaRambam al Yeshu, Kfar Nisgalsa, Lifnei Shmoinim Shon. This is in the Haboiker newspaper on Yutas Cheshvan Tavshin Yud, that's 11 November 1949, where they're saying, we know this already. This passage is not news. We know this already from 80 years ago. This article says that there's a man by the name of Tzvi Har Shefer, and he lives in Ra'anana, and he came to us, I guess the Haboiker newspaper, and he showed us a copy of the Rambam talking about this, which was published more than 80 years ago. Where was it published? It was published in a journal called Yeshurun, year 8, that came out in Tafresh Chavav 1866, and it was published by the editor, whose name is Yosef Yitzchak Kabak. Yes, Yosef Yitzchak Kabak, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, was the editor of the Yeshurun journal, and in Tafresh Chavav, it is indeed the case that on pages 120 and 121, he published this passage, just it's not Shana Shminis, as the article says, it is Shana Chamishis. It is the 5th year. And he basically says that there is something missing in the Mishneh Torah. I'd like to bring this to your attention. And so Tzvi Har Shefer tells the people at Haboiker about it, meaning they didn't know about this Yeshurun. But Tzvi Har Shefer did. Now the name Tzvi Har Shefer, when I was looking at this, rang a bell. And Tzvi Har Shefer, we can say, is a Lubavitcher. No, not Lubavitcher in the way you think about Lubavitcher. He's a Lubavitcher in that he was born and raised in Lubavitch. How do I know that? There's a letter from the Rebbe. Aleph, the Reish Chodesh Mar Chesron Toshin Tazayin, a man named Tzvi, and at the bottom they say Tzvi Har Shefer from Ra'anana. Okay, I don't think there's going to be 2 Tzvi Har Shefers from Ra'anana. The Rebbe writes, in response to your letter from Isruchak, where you said that you were born in Lubavitch, and you remember numerous things from the Tkufa of being in Lubavitch, the Tkufa of the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Rashab, and you remember Lubavitch, and you remember the guest who came, it would be appropriate for you to write down, to transcribe your Zichroinus, because there are very few people who remember the events very well from those days. And who also remember the types of people who were there in the Chatzar in Lubavitch. This is the first part that the Rebbe writes to Tzvi Har Shefer. Interestingly, Tzvi Har Shefer had already done that. In Tafshin Yudalid, in a Hebrew journal, so that's a year, more than a year before this letter of the Rebbe to him, in the journal called Ha'avar, Tzvi Har Shefer wrote Lubavitch, Moshev Admar Chabad, and he wrote a few pages about his memories of how things were then at the time. Okay, all of that is a parenthesis. The main thing is, Tzvi Har Shefer showed them this is not news, this is old. He wasn't the only person who got upset about this. There was a scholar and journalist by the name of Ben-Sion Katz. He also wrote an article in Haboiker a few days later, on the 25th of November, and he writes, Al Gilui, quote unquote, Chadash Kavayocha, as if this is a Gilui Chadash. And his main point is, firstly, he says, the translation is a travesty. He says this is not consistent with what Rambam actually said in the New York Times article, which he saw through the JTA. He points out that it was published already, he doesn't know about the Yeshurun. He actually says he looked in the Yeshurun and he couldn't find it, and now we know why, because there was a mistake there. It wasn't year 8, it was year 5, so it threw off Katz. But anyway, he says the main point, his point is he saw there was a man named Professor Joseph Klausner. Joseph Klausner wrote a book on the founder of Christianity in the early 20s, and he had the passage in there. Katz goes on, I might as well say here, Katz believed that the second half that says there was some good that came out of this, paving the way for Mashiach. Katz there's no way the Rambam could have written that, and he kind of rejects that. But I don't think anyone really takes that seriously today. All the evidence suggests that indeed that passage came from the Rambam, but I am letting you know that Katz took some space in this article to say that he doesn't believe the second part comes from the Rambam himself. You can always say Talmud Toya, some Talmud Toya wrote it, or whatever it is. He tells us that another thing he tells us here is, and where did Klausner get it? So he says Klausner got it from the Amsterdam Mishneh Torah. So the Amsterdam Mishneh Torah was printed in Amsterdam in 1702. Amsterdam is not under the Catholic Church. And in fact, there's a spirit of freedom that is in Amsterdam. A lot of book publishing happens the early part of the 16th century, Venice. But after this whole mess that we spoke about, although some continued in Venice, the capital of Jewish printing shifted to Amsterdam, definitely by the late 1600s and early 1700s to have a Mishneh Torah, and the whole passage is presented over there in brackets. And that's where Klausner saw this particular passage. Okay, so that's where it is. So it is incorrect to say that it didn't appear at all in print. You had the Amsterdam Mishneh Torah. People had that. And people would have seen that. It's, something printed in the 1500s, it comes around the year 1800, I don't know if you can have it, but something printed in 1702, you have it. What was that?
With the name there?
No. The name Yeshua Noitri is not there. It's the passage the way it was in the Af Oisai Shadima Sheyeh Moshiach. So it's the way it was in the Italian printings. And they just put it in brackets. Okay, now I showed you that there were two people who weren't so happy with the New York Times article, and they wrote that this is not true, or it was published before, whatever. Well, as it's going to turn out, very, very interestingly, the Rebbe also wrote a letter about this. This letter is dated October 27, 1949. October 27. Remember that original piece in the New York Times, I think was the 24 or the 25, so it's very soon thereafter. And it's addressed to Judaica Research, Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut, and it reads, "Gentlemen, with reference to the notice published in," it's originally said the New York Times in the first draft, the Rebbe changed it to your bulletin, meaning Yale. In reference to the notice published in your bulletin on October 24, 1949, regarding the quote, unquote, long lost statement on Christ by Maimonides discovered by Dr. Hirschman in early manuscripts. We would like to call your attention to the following facts. Number one, the statement of Maimonides' code has been known all along and was printed several times. And it was printed in all of those early printings 6 times, and then in the Amsterdam printing. That's in Rambam. It was also printed in other books that aren't Rambams, like that Yeshurun that I showed you before. It was, for instance, quoted in the collection on Maimonides' religio-philosophical writings, published in Jerusalem in 1935 under the editorship of Rabbi J.L. Fishman, Volume 2, page 317. So here is Rabbi Yudah Leib Fishman, later changed his name to Maimon. And here you see him sitting next to Ben Gurion. Indeed, they were very close. He was the first minister of religion in the after the founding of the state. And L'Regal Shmoina Mea Shana, 800 years from the Rambam's birthday, which he marked here in 1935, 1135 to 1935, he put out a book on the Rambam. And here on pages Shin Tazayin, Shin Yud Zayin, he says that in the manuscripts you have this passage, and he reproduces this passage. So the Rebbe is calling attention to this, that this is not a new discovery. Okay. However, it's very possible that were it just for that the Rebbe would not have sent, or prepared to send, at least we don't know that the Rebbe sent this letter. This was published, I assume the Rebbe sent it, but we don't know. In Tuf Shin Pei, very recently, there was a book that came, a sefer that was published with a lot of material on the last chapters of Hilchos Malachim. That's where this was published. I don't know the history, whose archive, who had this. I don't know.
Would Yale have it?
What was that?
Do Yale have it?
You can check. I don't know. So the reason I believe the Rebbe wrote was because of the second point. So let's read the second point. Due to incomplete quotation of the statement, several distortions and misrepresentations seem to have entered the passage printed in the mentioned notice in the New York Times. We therefore offer you the complete Hebrew text as printed in the Jerusalem edition of the Statement of Maimonides, and basically in where he just quoted from, and the Rebbe produces the entire Hebrew here. And then a translation. Okay, so let's read the Rebbe's translation now. Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who, I don't know what originally said there, but the Rebbe corrected it to, who imagined himself to become the Messiah, and was put to death by the court. The prophet Daniel said already, also the rebellious sons of thy people will lift themselves up to establish the vision, but they will stumble. Okay, and can there be a greater stumbling block than this? All the prophets affirmed that the Messiah would redeem Israel, save them of their dispersion, or gather them of their dispersion. And it said originally, the first draft said confirm the commandments. The Rebbe changed it to strengthen the commandments. Confirm is an ambiguous word. It could mean to strengthen, but it could also mean to say, yeah, I endorse it, that's a good idea. That's not what Mashiach, we don't need Mashiach to confirm it as much as to strengthen it. Okay, but he, meaning Yeshu, caused Israel to be destroyed by the sword, the remnant to be dispersed and humiliating, changing the Torah and misleading the world to serve gods besides the Lord. Yet no man can grasp the thoughts of the Lord, the creator of the world. For our ways are not his ways, and our thoughts are not his thoughts. And all the ways of Jesus of Nazareth, and of this Ishmaelite, meaning it said there of Muhammad, but the Rebbe changed it to this Ishmaelite, who rose after him, were only to clear the way for Messiah the King. When the Messiah will really arise and he will succeed. Okay, now there's ... here, meaning the Rebbe is not providing the information about the good things that came, the discussion of Torah and mitzvahs and all that. I don't know why, not in the Hebrew and not the English, the Rebbe does not provide it. When the Messiah will really arise and he will succeed and will reign supreme, at once they shall all return and will know that they inherited the untruth from their forefathers and that their prophets and forefathers have misled them.
The Rebbe changed it to lies.
Hold on, I'm reading from the top. Now, good. So that's that. Now what's confusing is that this paragraph, they have in this book where I'm taking it from, they have this paragraph, the Rebbe editing it twice. And some are the same edits, again, and some are different. So for example, untruth, which is it was less than true, or it was untrue. No, it was a lie, right? It's fine. So the Rebbe in the second one changed it to lies. So Goyim Arle Lev. So the Rambam spoke about Goyim Arle Lev. If you go back all the way here, let's find the good text. You'll see in the Yemen one, you'll see that the Rambam had Goyim Arle Lev. But I don't know why the Rebbe is writing that on the side. Here. You see, it's in the passage the Rebbe didn't translate. Uva amim rabim arle lev. It's like the fourth line in the second paragraph over there. But that's the paragraph the Rebbe didn't translate. So I don't know. Ich weiß nicht, but the Rebbe does write that on the side over here. And the Rebbe is basically saying that we gotta get the record straight. We have to set the record straight in terms of this translation. Okay, then the letter concludes. The above quoted and translated full text, but it's not full text, so the Rebbe took out full text. The above quoted and translated text gives quite a different meaning to the statement of Maimonides on Christ than the one conveyed in, it said New York Times, the Rebbe changed it to your notice, hoping that you will correct the misrepresentation, and then it once said that have arisen from the distortions. So the Rebbe took out those words that have arisen from the distortions. We are sincerely, and the Rebbe signed his name. What was that?
What was the last two
Distortions? We are sincerely. P.S. May we ask that you kindly refrain from quoting this letter or any part of it unless you quote the full text, not any excerpts. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. So this is very, very, very interesting. Now, in terms of the first claim that this was presented as a new discovery when it wasn't, so this was a little embarrassing for Hirschman. So November 13, 1939, there's special New York Times. The article is called "Not First on Maimonides." Hirschman explains he found views in old manuscript. And basically he says, I wish to state that I never said or intimated that I was the first to discover the passage. I copied it twice, once from a manuscript, and another time from an old edition in which the censor's erasures had evaporated, and I had no difficulty in deciphering the entire passage. So then where did this article come from? Who wrote that bulletin that sounded like this major new discovery and that sweeps across the Jewish world? I don't know. It's a very odd story. But if you read the news, this type of stuff happens. It's not unheard of for these types of things to happen. Okay, now the emes is, so I went to check out Hirschman's translation. What did he actually do in the, because I wanted to see, is the translation at fault here? Well, it turns out he didn't even put it in the book of Judges. Look over here. Look, number 4, if there's arise a king from the house of David, he says, if he does these things, he succeeds, he rebuilds the sanctuary, then he's beyond all doubt the Messiah, and then he says, L'saken kulei, Shchem echad, end the story. So he didn't even put it in over there. However, he did put it in his introduction. I don't know why he didn't put it in the actual text. The doesn't explain itself, but he does in the introduction. Roman numerette 23. He puts it in over there. He says, he puts the whole thing there. But if he does not meet, and now is once I saw this, how that Jesus wasn't fully successful. Like, where did that even come from? This is where it comes from. If you remember, the Rambam says that you can have a person who's chaskas Mashiach, but in lo yitzliach adkoi, so then he's like all good Jews or whatever. He's not Mashiach. In lo yitzliach adkoi. So he translates, but if he does not meet with full success or is slain, it is obviously he's not the Messiah. The next paragraph is when the Rambam starts talking about even the Jesus of Nazareth. So the writer of the article decided to borrow the language of im lo yitzliach adkoi, which Rambam is not saying about Yeshu. Yeshu is in a different category. Yeshu is not lo yitzliach adkoi, and so therefore very nice. He was chaskas Mashiach. Yeshu, you couldn't have a conversation about chaskas Mashiach. It's a whole different ballgame, right? But they took that language that he did not meet with full success. Yeshu did not meet with full success, and that led to that misleading statement in the New York Times. The rest of the quotes in the New York Times are directly lifted word for word from what Hirschman gives us in this introduction. The only problem with them is that they're not in full. All the problems are left out, other than the fact that it led to persecution against Jews, which in 1949 was on a lot of people's minds. That was the only thing that was put in, and all the other stuff wasn't put in, so it's a distortion in that sense. But yeah, it's very interesting that Hirschman did not put it in to his Targum in Hilchas Malachim or Melchama, only in this introduction. Okay, so that is pretty much the story of this passage. And then after World War II, the prince of the Rambam, starting with the Frankel Rambam and the Shelat Rambam and Rabbi Kapach's Rambam, started restoring these passages, and that's where they could be found in more standard printings that are available today. Okay, now it's time for us to wrap up. So we have over here a man by the name of Eliezer Steinman. And over the years, he had a significant correspondence with the Rebbe through letters. And in this particular letter that we're looking at, from Erev Pesach Toshin Yutes, this caught my attention. Basically, the Rebbe was trying to get him the Rebbe had written to him, apparently, I didn't see this letter, I don't know if this letter was printed, that in one of his books he quoted someone the Rebbe didn't want quoted. The Rebbe felt that like it's a hechsher almost on this person. So he defended it and said that, what do you mean? I have to be makir toida to anyone who I learned from. And I learned from this person. And ein lekapeh schar kol beria. Everyone deserves a reward. So that's why I quoted him. Here's the Rebbe's response. Hine ayras teresenu teres chaim bazehi. The teaching of Torah is yeshna yoytze echad miklal omer. There is one type of person who we actually don't show any gratitude toward. When it comes to the sphere of belief in Hashem and hasasa ladas acheres, pushing and prodding people to another religion. In the Rambam Gimel Prakim, we're learning now about the Mesis. That's the person who we say, like all bets are off when it comes to that type of person. So if I had to guess, the Rebbe is referring to someone who's not just had puzzle beliefs, but was doing something that was crossing over in terms of Christianity. I have one or two candidates in my head who this could have been, but I'm not going to say. All right. Va'ad kama nifloin divrei Amoira Agadol, who are Rambam b'sayf sifrei Mishneh Torah, chuzmach b'sayf Perek Yud b'negel Yeshu u'Muhammad, where the Rambam wrote, she'enon elo liyasher derech lamelech HaMashiach l'saken es'elam kul elav Hashem b'yachad, that they're only there to pave the way for Mashiach and to correct the world so that we reach the day where we're all serving Hashem together. Wow, so the Rambam said that. V'yachad emzeh, nonetheless, 3 times a day, we reference them in Aleinu with well-known terms, and we once spoke about Lehevav Larik, a direct allusion to Yeshua Muhammad. Go back, check the tape, and if you forgot, shame on you. Okay. Now, V'divrei Rambam Amurim, so Rambam said nice things about them in a certain way. But at the end of the day, we say 3 times a day, and we almost forgot these Rambam words, parenthesis, censor, question mark, I don't know, is it because of the censor? Or something else with the question mark in the middle? Very, very interesting. But the Rebbe seems to be saying that, this is like the fact that we forgot this passage means something. It's not just that it was censorship. No, it means something because we almost wanted to forget the passage because we almost don't like what the Rambam said over there. We say Aleinu all the time. As we say by the Masons, you're not allowed to learn bimalamet chus on it. And he says, if you think about Jewish history during the long period of comings and goings, it's dafke kanoah zu sha'amdalanu liyas nitzavim bayayim kol chol nefnei Hashem lekechem. It is this kanos that has kept us going. So the Rebbe is telling him, because this person goes into this category of prodding people a little bit toward Christianity, I think, so therefore the rule of gratitude doesn't apply for this person. And look, we almost don't paskin like the Rambam, as much as the Rambam said that a nice thing. Now, important to stress, the Rambam is very careful. He didn't say Yeshua Muhammad did good or anything like that. He says, this is what they did. And then he says, and God is Einon El Yasher. It's like, these are things, what do we understand? These are things that are going to be steps in that direction. But Alpha became, the Rebbe seems to be saying that, but still, we forgot that because we don't want to be grateful to them and we don't want to say almost anything nice about them. And that's really interesting because as much as it's censorship, the Rebbe seems to be saying another thing together with that, that's more internal, that's more Jewish. Okay. Does that mean it shouldn't be restored to text? I don't think the Rebbe is saying that. I just think the Rebbe is trying to bring out a certain point over here. Okay. And now the last thing that we're going to say is as follows. All of this, we really focused on one passage, or the references to Yeshu in the Mishneh Torah. As we're going to see, this 1574 edition of the Mishneh Torah is much more thoroughly censored. Many other adjacent areas. Next week, we're going to reconvene, and we're going to see the large impact of this censorship, way beyond what we saw today. This is just the beginning of the story. And so, in that regard, I want to just conclude with this. Shabbos Vayesei Tavshem Mem Gimel, where the Rebbe said the following story, that when they printed the Likutei Torah in the times of the Rebbe Rashab, so Reb Anshel Aronovich, he was a Tayere Yid, the Rebbe says. He was the one who corrected the entire Likutei Torah and he got rid of a few thousand mistakes. And then when he told this to David Hirschel, The Rebbe says this is how they referred to the Radat Chaim, the David Hirsch Chernigover. The Chernigover Rav was known as David Hirschel. The Rebbe went and discussed the fact that Chassidim didn't call him rabbi. The Rebbe discussed that here. Okay, is Vishas David Hirschel had gehört wegen die Greisen. He heard about this, that he corrected in Likutei Torah. He wasn't happy, and he explained, before you fix these mistakes, we had to harave and the mimer with the mistakes to understand the pshat, and you have to think about it, and you have to look in other places what's the pshat until you realize that it was a mistake. But now that you fix the mistake, so a yid learns a mimer very, very quickly, then he goes to sleep. So the Rebbe was saying that this is what the Radatz was saying. In other words, there's a certain mila when you have a corrupted text. The mila in a corrupted text makes you work a lot harder. So the Rebbe concluded, is das was David Hirschel gesagt, gut, is al derech hatzachos, this is his hergish. But poil, the din is, a sefer shein and muga is not something that we want to have, and we need to have good books. But at the end of the day, there's a limud chos that when you encounter, so if you're learning Rambam, and you're doing it from the Vilna edition, and you're going to bump into the text, and by the way, in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, you have this a lot of it is censored, and some things aren't making sense, that's a good thing. That's an opportunity for more haravanya, more hours with the text, and more limud Torah. But at the end of the day, we want to have good Rambams, and the good thing is, the Baruch Hashem, today, there are plenty of options in this regard. So again, next week we'll reconvene, and we'll do more of the specific details of this censorship that began then in 1574. Tzlacha.